Good morning. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to today's event, The Economics of Care, What's at Stake for Women in the Workforce. My name is Jocelyn Fry. I'm a senior fellow with the Women's Initiative at the Center for American Progress, and we are so pleased that you're taking time out of your schedules to join us today. I am sure that everybody who is listening is well aware of the current moment. The US is still feeling the effects of the COVID-19 global pandemic, and we are in an active conversation about how we can recover, both economically and from a health perspective. And in this moment where we have this active debate, one of the conversations is about what are the elements of a recovery? And in particular, what is the role of care, caregiving, care work, and what is the role of women, not only in terms of the economic recovery of our country, but also the economic stability of families. And we wanted to focus on the economics of care and have a conversation about what are some of the policy ideas and solutions that we need to really consider and examine as we collectively try to determine how best to promote a robust economic recovery. And to discuss these issues, we identified four extraordinary experts who are brilliant in their own right, and we thought that they would be really instrumental in helping us talk through these issues. They have lengthy bios worthy of their accomplishments. I'm just going to read a brief snippet and then get right into our discussion. First, and I'm going to list them alphabetically. Dr. Lisa Cook is a professor of economics and international relations at Michigan State University. She was the first Marshall Scholar from Spelman College. She also earned a BA degree from Oxford and her PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. She is a widely read, noted scholar, a leader in the economics profession, and we're so pleased to have her with us. Ai-jen Poo is the co-founder and executive director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. The NDWA is a leading, groundbreaking nonprofit that has made as its central thesis the importance of quality work, dignity, and fairness for the folks who care for us in our homes, clean our homes, the majority of whom are immigrant women and women of color. NDWA has been a leader across the country in moving domestic workers' bill of rights in 10 states and 2 cities, and bringing over 2 million home care workers protections under the minimum wage. She is an accomplished scholar and thought leader, was the 2014 MacArthur Genius Award recipient, and she has a BA from Columbia, honorary doctorates from Smith, New School, and the City University of New York. Dr. Heidi Scherholz is senior economist, director of policy at the Economic Policy Institute. She leads EPI's work around monitoring wage and employment policies and a worker-first policy agenda. She also is a widely thought of thought leader and often sought out for her analysis of the economy. She also was the chief economist at the Department of Labor during the Obama administration. She earned her BA in mathematics from Grinnell, master's degrees from Iowa State and the University of Michigan, and a PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Aaron Sojourner. He's a labor economist, associate professor at the University of Minnesota's Carlson School of Management. His research focuses on labor market institutions, policies to promote efficient and equitable human development of human capital, particularly around early childhood and K-12 education systems, and behavioral economic approaches to consumer finance decisions. He also is a frequently sought out thought leader. He writes extensively on a range of economic issues, particularly around early childhood development and childcare. He also served in the Obama administration at the Council of Economic advisors. He has his PhD in economics from Northwestern, an MA in public policy from the University of Chicago, and a BA in history from Yale University. So you all are an impressive, if not scary, group. And so I'm so appreciative of all of you being here to help us just sort of talk through a few issues this morning. I want to start with you, Lisa, just to sort of level set a little bit. And I'm going to ask you a couple questions, and I'm going to go through a series of questions with all of you and maybe pitch one general question that I asked all of you. But, I began the conversation, Lisa, talking about the fact that we are in this unique moment where we're talking about economic recovery. There's a lot of conversation about infrastructure. I'm sure there are lots of folks who, up until a few months ago, never used the word infrastructure terribly often, but now we seem to talk about it a lot. And there's also been pushback around the notion of what we think infrastructure is, and particularly around the concept of including caregiving and caregiving supports for care workers in any sort of conversation about infrastructure. And so I wondered if you could just kick us off with talking a little bit about why it is important to have a conversation about care and infrastructure together, and how you see those ideas being connected in terms of our overall economic recovery.
Thank you, Jocelyn. As a macroeconomist, I am very concerned about long-run growth and the inputs to long-run growth. And I care about any of the inputs that could sustain this long-run growth and support this at every juncture. I care about care because it is one of those things. And infrastructure supports the rest of the economy. So it's broad-based and it should be equitable. With respect to care, I would argue that this is one element, one input that will help this sustain long-run growth and make it more equitable. And I'll give you an example from the innovation economy. That's typically what I work on. That's one of my big research areas. And I and other economists have found that if women participated more in the innovation economy, the economy could be 4.4% larger, up to 4.4% larger. And what I also find, and this is why it's relevant, is that mixed gender patent teams are more productive than single sex patent teams, whether they're male or female. So if we're not using all of the human resources we have in the economy and making it possible for people to participate, then we are leaving $20 bills, as the economists say, on the ground. We're not maximizing our potential, and we're not raising living standards as much as we could. And one of the main policies that I have talked about in terms of augmenting women's participation in the innovation economy is childcare and family leave. And that's why I would suggest that these conversations can't be separate if we're really talking about equitable, broad-based, long-run growth and augmenting living standards, not just the recovery, but a sustainable economy.
Thank you for that. So you're really talking about not simply what we do in the short term, but really over the long haul, and how we make use of everybody to promote a strong economy. So thank you for starting us there. I want to move to you, Ai-jen, because you also have been working a lot on caregiving, and it is certainly your day-to-day bread and butter. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you think caregiving is so important from your vantage point, why you think it's important for us to have that conversation now in the context of this conversation about economic recovery.
Absolutely. And I just want to say thank you, Jocelyn, for bringing us together, and to CAP for the incredible work that you all are doing in this space. It's been so wonderful to have a partner in you, Jocelyn, and in CAP. I'll just pick up where Dr. Cook left off to say that, in the United States, we are in a moment when we demographically need more care than ever before. 10,000 baby boomers turn 65 every day. And because of advances in healthcare and technology, we're living longer than ever. So we've essentially added an entire generation onto our lifespan in this country and changed none of the policies, systems, or even the culture to adapt to that. So we're wholly unprepared to care for this growing aging population that's going to double by the year 2050. And then we have, on the other end of the generational spectrum, millennials giving birth to 4 million babies per year. And before the pandemic, we would rely upon mostly women as family caregivers to be our default care infrastructure. That was already unsustainable pre-pandemic. It was already a simmering crisis for so many working families who are struggling to afford childcare, elder care, support for loved ones with disabilities, who couldn't take a paid time off to take care of their loved ones because their jobs didn't support that. And so it was already an incredible struggle. And then the pandemic just collapsed the entire house of cards. And what we saw was millions of women, disproportionately women of color, getting pushed out of the workforce because of caregiving challenges. And so this idea that care infrastructure, systems, policies, including a really strong care workforce, is essential and fundamental to our ability to participate in the economy and really to participate in society as a whole, was really revealed for all of us to see, even as we were shut behind closed doors during the pandemic. And I think now is the moment for us. We have this opportunity coming out of the pandemic to really reset our economy for this next era, for greater long-term health, to Dr. Cook's point, for greater equity, and also to make sure that everyone can be a part of our recovery. Prioritizing care achieves all of those things.
Thank you. Thank you so much, iJen, for sort of putting that perspective, on the table. I want to come back to something that you said about the experience of care workers. But before I do, I want to pull Erin and Heidi into this discussion. And Erin, I know you have written extensively on childcare and early education and sort of why those investments are particularly important. I wonder if you could add to this discussion about why you think those sorts of investments are important now and how sort of investing in early education is important from an economic perspective.
Yeah, thank you. The key point to me is that we ask the most of families when they have the least. And the way that our public policy is structured right now, in recent decades and right now, is that we start investing a lot in kids and families once the kids turn 5. We have a public K-12 system that invests about $13,000 per child per year once they're for 13 years between sort of 5 and 17. But in those first 5 years of kids' lives, we are putting in maybe a ninth of that per kid per year. We're 12%, something like that, about $1,500 per year per kid. And that means that families are being crushed by this dual responsibility of care and earning. Like, you have to put a roof over your family's head, and you have to provide care for a child who really needs care all the time. And, parents are stretched. They only have so many hours in the day. Once the kid hits 5, we do share that burden with them in a more substantial way. But in those first 5 years, the burden falls heavily because the public doesn't invest much. But also, families have the least when their kids are young. They have had less time to work and save. They have lower earning power when their kids are young than they will when their kids are older. And they do have more future income, but we documented in a report I did at CEA that for the first time that they have lower credit scores. So they have less access to future income than when their kids are older. Past, present, and future income, that's all the private income. There's no other magic source of private income that families can use in this time of life. So the public puts in less, privately, families have less. And so it manifests as a crisis, a shortage of investment in kids. And what that means is that the returns are very high, especially in the most disadvantaged families, because the levels of investment are so low. It can make a really big impact on kids' lives. And there's a lot of evidence from rigorous experiments and policy experiments that show investments in high quality care during these first few years of life can make a huge impact. But it really does depend on quality of care, which really does depend on making sure that the people doing the work are stable, that they can build strong relationships with the kids, that this is a professional job, and the real value that those care workers are creating through their work in those children and for those families and for the broader community is recognized and compensated.
Thank you for that. Lisa started us sort of talking about sort of from a macro perspective, what we need to think about and talked in particular about the importance of women in the economy. Ai-jen then touched on the sort of the centrality and integral role of care and caregiving. And Erin, now you've spoken about the importance of investing sort of early in families with early education. And Heidi, I wonder, the thing that I know you've written extensively about that Lisa sort of alluded to at the beginning, and Ai-jen did as well, is thinking a little bit and talking a little bit about what's happened over the past year. And in particular, what has happened in our economy and what's happened to women. And I wonder, I know that that's, we could spend hours talking about that, but can you give us like a quick overview of, what's happened over the past year that is of concern that we sort of need to address, given just the pandemic and the effects on our economy? What is it that we should take away from what's happened?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I will give a quick overview, and the word unprecedented doesn't begin to touch what we've just been through. So just like a year ago, or a little over a year ago, in March and April of 2020, we lost 22 million jobs in the economy. And I think a key thing is both men and women saw a huge drop in employment, but women saw a much bigger drop. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that women are more likely to be relegated to the low wage, face-to-face service jobs that saw huge job loss, not just care jobs, but and also many other industries with face-to-face interactions. And one key thing is women didn't just see a bigger increase in employment, they also saw a bigger drop in labor force participation. A lot more women had to drop out of the labor force as a result of COVID, due in no small part to disproportionate care responsibilities that women shoulder. And I think so that's a sort of broad overview. I think one key thing that has to be central in this discussion is those trends were dramatically worse for women of color. Women of color saw much greater declines in employment than white women. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that they aren't just facing occupational segregation, discrimination, other labor market disparities that are a result of structural sexism, but also of structural racism. And another sort of, as we're coming out of this, one interesting dynamic that we're seeing is since the worst of the recession, white women have actually had a relatively quick bounce back. White women are still in a big hole, but they're recovering from this recession at a faster pace than other groups. Women of color, particularly Black women and Hispanic women, are still very, very far behind. So where we stand right now, this COVID recession and its recovery is continuing to exacerbate existing inequalities based on gender and race.
Thank you. And Heidi, your point about both what happened but also sort of the disproportionate effects of the pandemic is exactly where I wanted to go. And so I want to pick up where you ended. And I want to ask you, Lisa, I know you have written extensively about the connections between race and economic inequality, and sort of how do we ensure that we're actually pursuing policies that address inequality and racial and ethnic disparities. So I want to pivot to sort of what is it that we need to fix, right? Like where do we need to now focus our attention given what we know about what just happened and some of the disparate effects that we've seen with the pandemic? What are the things that you focus on when you think about sort of inequities in the economy around race and gender and the needs of women of color? What are the priorities that you would focus on, Lisa?
I would pick up where Heidi left off and piggyback on what you've written about, Jocelyn, and that is workplace climate. And when I say climate, I mean in the broadest sense, not just in terms of sexual or racial harassment and the systemic racial and gender and equities, but you see employers offering better workplace climate, more stable schedules, appetizers, gas cards, and childcare, something that should have been a part of a package for any working adult, any working person in America. So I really think that what I'm focused on is how employers are understanding what employees are doing and how they're responding to what employees have wanted for a long time. And that Aijen and her colleagues have been arguing for a long time. So that's what I'm paying attention to, because again, if I'm just using the example of the innovation economy, and the innovation economy is as a critical input into long-run economic growth and higher living standards, we've got to have the folks who are doing the care being taken care of so that we can have something that's fundamental in economics, which is specialization. Like people can go to work and actually do the jobs that they're capable of doing, that they want to do, work the hours they want to work, have the career they want to have. And I certainly think that there's this realignment happening. I think that many economists are observing between employer power and employee power. And I think employees have really thought, especially in the sectors that Heidi was talking about, the public-facing caregiving and other industries, they're thinking about their options. And there's been a lot of discussion about their options. I mean, think about it. The care economy was not a term a year ago. It was not a term. I mean, Aijen would probably argue with all of us, but nobody knew that term. Nobody would concede to even debate this. There has been a dramatic shift, and you cannot become ignorant. This is public discourse. Now, whether you want to put it in infrastructure or not is a part of what we're discussing today. And of course, I argue that it should be. But I'm just saying that it is a debate. The minimum wage, raising the minimum wage. There are people who in niche sectors in various states talking about that. And now the reason for having a higher minimum wage is something that many people in the broader public can articulate. Certainly low-wage workers can articulate and have been articulating this for some time. But I'm just saying that there is a seismic shift that is happening. I think a generational shift that is happening. And I think that this is what I'll be watching.
Thank you for that. And I think your point is well taken about sort of I think Heidi used the word unprecedented, sort of unprecedented nature of the pandemic. And I like your word of the seismic shift in the conversation. I think that that's absolutely right. Jenna, I want to ask you a question. I think back to something that you wrote not long ago about why investing in care was important. One of the things that's always struck me about this conversation about care is that on the one hand, care is so essential. It's about our families, our loved ones. We all want people that we care about to be cared for. But yet, when it comes to how we actually treat care from an economic perspective, it's underpaid, and the workers are often undervalued. And so there's this very strange contradiction in terms of how we think about care, how we treat care. And I know you've thought a lot about this, about why that happens, and the devaluation of care workers in particular. And so as we think about what the investments are and should be, I wonder if you could sort of center us a little bit in why isn't this a no-brainer? Like what have you seen in terms of our unwillingness to invest in care workers? What's really happening in terms of this sort of contradiction in sort of how we talk about care, how we treat sort of caregiving? What do you think is going on, and what do you think we need to be focused on if we're really trying to be responsive to the need of workers and families?
Well, I think there's at least three things going on, and I'm a little intimidated because we have the top economists in the country on this panel, so I'm just going to do my thing. So the first thing that I think is going on is something that Gloria Steinem talked about back in the 70s, which is this idea that our economic model is built on taking two essential resources for granted and rendering them invisible. The first being the planet's natural resources, and the second being caregiving. And so we've kind of built this model that assumes that those things are going to be inputs that we can just take for granted. And so that's one piece. And then the second piece is that I think before the pandemic, certainly, it's kind of embedded in our mental model around individualism that care and caregiving is a personal responsibility and burden. And if we cannot manage or afford it, it's a personal failure. And most people were making meaning of the care crisis as a crisis of personal failures, right? That we didn't save, we are a bad parent, we don't have the right job. And that somehow, if we did things differently, we would be in a better position. And I think that the seismic shift that Dr. Cook talked about is that I think everyone in the pandemic recognized that we are just doing our very best and it's not sufficient. We need infrastructure, policy, programs, and a workforce that can support us, because this is a public good and a need that requires collective solutions. And the third most profound piece of all of this is the way that race and gender have shaped our relationship to care in this country and globally, where the responsibility of care has always been assumed that women will take on and taken for granted that women will somehow manage, will woman up and take care of things. And then it's always been associated as a profession with Black women and women of color who have always been underpaid and undervalued. And our first domestic workers many of them were enslaved Black women. And the legacy of slavery and deep structural racism has been the imprint through which we've actually treated this workforce in law and policy, in the most striking example being in the New Deal. Another moment very similar to the one that we're in, where Congress was debating and discussing how we're going to put some labor laws into place to protect our workforce and strengthen our economy. And Southern Dixiecrats refused to support those measures if they included farm workers and domestic workers who were Black workers at the time. And in that exclusion, created this second-class citizen tier or less than real worker designation of domestic and care work that we still live with today. Culturally, we still call domestic work help as opposed to the full-time profession it is for millions of women, mostly women of color. So those roots are deep, and it's not history, it's present. And that's why the idea that we could right here and now invest in the care economy, prioritize investments in the care workforce as central to our economic recovery from this moment is actually profound. It actually is about building back better. As opposed to like a narrative frame. It's like actually that's what it is. And I think it's profound that we have that opportunity before us. And the last thing I'll say is these are jobs that can't be outsourced, and they're not going to be automated, at least anytime soon, right? There's no algorithm for empathy. We're going to need people doing this work. We have tons of dedicated caregivers who want to do this work. They just also need to be able to take care of themselves and their families while doing it. That is the choice before us right now.
Thank you for that and for laying out that history. I think it does put front and center the challenge. And I think your point that this is sort of baked into sort of how our country has functioned for a long time is so important as we think about, you use the words build back better, how do we actually not simply recover, but actually get ourselves into a better place. And I want to move to you, Erin, building on both what Lisa said and what Ijen said about sort of history. Because, one of the conversations that I hear a lot amongst the economists and the experts is, what recovery ought to look like. And, there is this narrative amongst some that, all we have to do is just get back to where we were, right? Like the status quo, if we could just get back to where we were in January 2020, we would be golden. And I wonder if you could speak to, whether or not that's the right answer. Why isn't that the right answer? What are some of the inequities that you think pre-pandemic we needed to have been focused on that we need to think about now as we talk about a meaningful recovery?
That's a big question, and but it's a great question, and I'll do my best. So that, I think I would definitely trade pre-pandemic economy for the one we have right now, and the pre-pandemic reality for the one we have now. But man, there were a lot of problems before the pandemic, and there were a lot of structural issues in the economy that needed to be fixed. And I think the pandemic did expose and bring to the fore a lot of those problems and make people appreciate the value of a well-functioning economy and like how bad things can be without that. So, again, care, building off of what Jen was saying too, people talk about the future of work, like what is this new economy that we're trying to build towards? It is a care economy. The automation, artificial intelligence, like they can do a lot of things, and they should, and make it more efficient, make it more productive. A labor market is all about, what do we want from each other? What's the highest, best use of each person's time? And as doing mechanical, routine kind of things, we need less people to do that. Machines can take that over. What do we need from each other? What do we want from each other? We want care. We want up close and personal work that is, and it becomes possible. It becomes possible to use people's time that way, and to use their empathy and to use their presence in that way. And that's wonderful. And that's exciting, because it does open up new possibilities for job quality, for services, for exchange. And so I think also, Jen said, it's a public good. And I want to just develop that point a little more. Especially referring to like early care and education and K-12 education is a public good, in the sense that if you just leave it to the market, if you just say, let each person deal with it alone, you're going to get outcomes that are worse for everybody, or for the society, because the investments that are made in kids, they pay off in their adulthood. They pay off many years ahead. And the people, if you just leave it to the family to bear those private costs, they're going to not be able to marshal the resources, and they're not going to take into account the benefits that those investments have on everyone, on the kids' future neighbors and future coworkers. And so there really is a need for a greater public investment, and there's a strong economic justification for it. So, I think we are in a time where there are big, bold, smart proposals for the first time in a long time to invest in work that our communities need done, to invest in, some of that is hard infrastructure, like roads and bridges and modernizing the electric grid and converting, moving away from a climate crisis creating, energy economy to a more sustainable economy. Part of that is care work that enables people to specialize, as Dr. Cook said. And I think it's great. One statistic that hasn't gotten a lot of attention that I thought was really important around the administration's proposals is that 90% of the jobs created by the American Families Plan and American Jobs Plan don't require a college degree. And, these are like construction and retrofitting, but also care work that are opportunities. If you look in the last 6 decades, opportunities for folks with less formal education have been eroding, and the earnings and the employment opportunities have been eroding. It's been harder for people to find a productive place in our economy. And that's led to all kinds of problems in our society as well. And we have the chance to match people up to work that needs done, that the market alone will not invest to make happen. And it's exciting possibilities ahead. I think if we make investments now, we can create earnings opportunities for people who need it. We can create better infrastructure and systems in our communities, and we can, have a more productive future ahead.
Thank you for putting some of this into that perspective about sort of how the future investments we make now can pay off in the future. Heidi, there are a couple of things that I want to pick up with you. One is, I know that you wrote something recently about the other thing that people are talking a lot about is the what some have called labor shortages. I know people have taken issue with that term and whether or not that's really what's happening. But I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about what you see happening at the moment in terms of sort of these anecdotes about labor shortages, and also speak to why investing in women workers is important at this moment. Just sort of picking up on the point about that Erin was making about current investments and what those look like now and what that could mean for our future. So labor shortages and sort of investing in women's paid work.
Austin, these are such good questions. There's some, like, it's the perfect framing. So to bring in this insane conversation that we're having everywhere about labor shortages to this conversation. So one of the things we are hearing, I mean, everywhere you turn, you hear stories about labor shortages. Bona fide labor shortages are much, much less pervasive than all the sort of breathless talk about them would suggest. To the extent they're happening, they're really sort of isolated to a few sectors, primarily in leisure and hospitality, where that's a sector that includes restaurants. They're really not happening economy-wide. But we're hearing all of these like, there's just a ton of talk about it. There's headlines everywhere that's talking about people are seeing the stronger wage growth in places like leisure and hospitality, and then concluding that workers have a ton more leverage now. And I'm getting all these questions about, is this a permanent shift in worker power? And I just want to be clear that that is not going to be a permanent shift in worker power without us doing more. Even if there are some, and I do believe there's some isolated labor shortages going on right now, the power that transfers to workers, and it does, is temporary, and it's not going to undo the 4 decades of suppression of workers' wages and job quality. So one of the things I get asked is, where do you think things are going forward in this economy? And I think we will see very strong job growth over the next many, many months. We are, with the distribution of the vaccine and the relief and recovery things that Congress have done to set us up for strong growth going forward, we're going to get good job growth, but that does not mean we're going to have an equitable recovery. It does not mean workers are going to have power. It does not mean that the jobs that come back are going to be good jobs. And so in the care work context there, and Ijen talked about this a little bit, but we know that more than 90% of care jobs are held by women. Over half of care jobs are held by women of color. On an hourly basis, care workers are paid about 3/4 of what other workers with similar demographic characteristics who do other jobs are paid. Care workers are much more likely to be poor or near poor. So really focusing on this group is just, it's difficult to think of a better strategy for an equitable recovery than making sure these care jobs are good jobs. And then one thing, I'll just say one more thing on this that I think is important. These jobs are growing no matter what we do. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics projects that almost 1 in 5 jobs created over the next decade will be either a home health aide or a personal care aide. So that doesn't even count other kinds of care work. Just those 2 occupations, 1 in 5 jobs over the next decade will be in one of those 2 occupations. So here's the thing, even without the investments to make them good jobs, those jobs will be there. There will be people in them. They will be almost all women. They will be majority women of color. Without investments to make them good jobs, just a huge share of the people in those jobs will earn poverty or near poverty wages, with the extremely high turnover and the sort of hugely reduced quality of care that accompanies that. So this is really focusing on this sector is such an opportunity to make these good jobs with good wages and benefits, with worker voice. It's like, I think of this as a long run investment in the quality of care. It's really good immediate stimulus. It's an equity strategy. It's a worker power strategy. It sort of hits a ton of the different buttons on making this the right policy for the kind of economy we want to have right now.
I saw thumbs up from iGen, so I think you get agreement from the folks on this panel. And I know we have a few questions in the queue, and so I'm going to turn to those in a minute. I do want to pick up, though, on something that I think was implicit in your conversation, or your words, Heidi, and something that Lisa said early, and I'll probably turn to both of you. And where does paid leave fit in this conversation, right? Like, the other thing, in addition to investments in childcare and in the care economy generally, there's been a lot of conversation about paid leave. And I'll start with you, Heidi. Why are we talking about paid leave? Like, why is that at all connected to women's participation in the economy?
I'll get myself off mute. It's huge. It's hugely important for women's participation in the economy, because we know women still shoulder disproportionate responsibilities for care work. The ability to, when life gets chaotic because of those responsibilities, is absolutely crucial that there is some flexibility, that there is paid time off, so workers can meet those care responsibilities and work in the paid labor force. There's lots of good international comparisons that show, the US used to be a leader in women's labor force participation, but over the last couple of decades, it's really dropped off relative to peer countries. And I'm not talking about the COVID era right now, but sort of the lead up, the long run structural changes. And peer countries have just, as women's labor force participation in the US has really flattened off, peer countries have continued to grow and grow and grow. And there's a lot of evidence that that's due to policies that peer countries have put in place, like paid leave, like other kinds of policies that support women's ability to meet caregiving responsibilities and be in the paid labor force. That's just a key linchpin for making that happen. So it is deeply crucial to those policies have given those countries a leg up. It adds to their economy. It's just a really important, it allows women's contribution to sort of be way more fully realized. And we're missing out, adding chaos to workers' families, and missing out on that really important economic contribution that could be being made if we did this in the right way.
Great, thank you for that. I am cognizant of time. First of all, I could talk to you all just all day. You all are just, each of you is brilliant in sort of how you think about these issues, and I fully appreciate, particularly, all of you, how you sort of both centered us in the conversation about where we are now, but also sort of given us this broader perspective. I do want to make sure that I touch on some of the questions. We do have questions in the chat, and so I'm going to try to get to a few of them, even though I have lots of questions that I really want to ask you, but trying to be to make sure that we're including some of the other questions that folks have raised. There are a couple of questions that have come in about sort of models and sort of what are the models that we ought to be looking to, either in our country or internationally, around caregiving and caregiving supports. Are there models that we should be invoking as we think about what are the investments that we ought to be thinking about? And related to that, are some particular investments that we should be thinking about in terms of caregiving for older adults, just given the aging population. Again, as we think about investments that we need now, but may pay off in the long run. So does anybody want to speak to just the issue of, what are the models for caregiving supports that we ought to be thinking about? Are there models that we see domestically that we point to, or models that we should be looking at internationally? And are there unique investments for older adults that we should be thinking about? Does anybody want to take some of that on?
I can speak to a quick domestic example of a state that I think is further along. And I just want to talk a minute about Washington State, because Washington State is a state where there is a really strong union representing home care workers, SEIU Local 775. And the state has decided to make an investment in the care infrastructure for elder care in particular. And so they've created, with the partnership of the union, the Washington State Home Care Training Fund, which is the second largest educational institution in the state after the University of Washington. And it trains 40,000 home care workers per year, has continuing education and specializations, has pop-ups in rural communities to support workers in rural communities, 12 different languages the courses are taught in, and so that you have a workforce that, because of the union, has been able to negotiate for higher pay. So the starting base pay is higher than the rest of the country. And their benefits, including retirement and healthcare. And then there's training that leads to a better quality of service, as does higher wages. And then there's also this new long-term care benefit that they've created, a social insurance fund. So in addition to people who are receiving care through the Medicaid program, there's also, in addition to that, more universal access, or more access to long-term care for people in the state from the consumer side. So I would say Washington State is better prepared than most states in the country for what's to come in terms of the needs around elder care.
Great, thank you for that, Ai-jen. Aaron, did you want to speak to that?
I'll just add that, also investments that help elders stay in their homes longer. This is part of what Ai-jen's talking about in Washington State, in Minnesota too. And many states have similar programs to help people find home healthcare services through Medicaid funding. Right now we force people into a choice, basically to survive at home as long as they can, or go into super expensive assisted living that they can't really afford for long. And most people can't even access that, or into a skilled nursing facility, a nursing home, which is, very intensive care, very expensive care, and building out alternatives that help people stay in their homes longer can really be a win-win in terms of providing the support and care elders want, and saving money, keeping people, giving services that are less intensive in the community, and setting up systems that create quality there, make those good jobs, ensure elders and their families have choices, and get the care they want in the setting they want, can make a big difference in families' lives.
Thank you so much for that, Aaron. There's another question in the chat that actually picks up on an issue that I think Ai-jen alluded to, and that's the fact that a lot of the women that we're talking about who perform care work are immigrant women, and it reminds us of the interconnected nature of so many of the issues that we're grappling with, including the overlay of immigration and immigration policy, and how do we make sure that we are supportive of immigrants who come to our country and who are contributing every day to our economy in a myriad of ways. And I wonder if there are thoughts that any of you have in terms of how we ensure that we're actually sort of doing making these investments, doing this all at the same time. How are we sort of keeping front of mind not only getting people back to work, but also ensuring that we're treating all of the different workers fairly, and making sure that we are, investing and addressing things like immigration policy and so forth. It's a big question, but I want to make sure that I ask it because the questioner was right that we hadn't really touched on that issue in depth, and it's an important one. So does anybody just want to speak to, even briefly, the sort of the importance of addressing immigration in this conversation as well?
I'll kick us off by just saying that a third of the workforce that currently supports the elderly and people with disabilities in the home and community providing that care is foreign born. So the care economy is incredibly reliant upon immigrant workers. And there's actually no way to imagine meeting our growing need for care as a country without fully embracing and integrating a strong immigrant care workforce. It is such an all hands on deck situation that we're going to need family caregivers, friends and neighbors, a strong care workforce, immigrant and non-immigrant, and there will still be more care to provide. So this is not a zero-sum situation here. And if we invest in the immigrant care workforce, which we do have the opportunity to do right now, with a pathway to citizenship, it will just facilitate our lifting of the floor for the entire workforce. And right now, there's a big push to ensure that immigrant essential workers who essentially kept us safe and kept the economy afloat through the pandemic have a pathway to citizenship, including immigrant care workers. So there's a big push for that right now. And I would say that is not only beneficial in the short term for the purposes of our economic recovery, but just looking at the care sector alone, so essential to our project of making these jobs good jobs in the long term.
Great, thank you, Ai-jen. You, I think you said a lot in a brief moment. I'm getting pinged by our wonderful CAP events people that we are nearing the end, and so I want to be cognizant of time. I will say that I'm so appreciative of the four of you being here with us. I could literally ask you questions all day long because you have so many brilliant thoughts, and I wish you all were just making all the decisions, because everything you all said was perfectly reasonable to me. But I just want to say thank you so much for helping us to talk through some of the economics of care, why investing in care is so important, and why it's integral not only for women's workforce participation, but really for the stability and sustainability of our economy and our families. You all are just terrific, and we want to do whatever we can to continue to support the great work that you do. And so Lisa Cook, Ai-jen Poo, Heidi Scherholtz, Aaron Sojourner, thank you for just taking time out of your day to help us talk through these issues. And to our audience, thank you for the questions. Thank you for joining us. And thank you for just showing interest in these issues. And with that, I want to say, have a great day and a great week, and hope to see you again for another conversation on the economy and care and women in the workforce. Have a great day.
Thanks so much, Kat.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. That's great.